The flesh of the innocent. Victor Ashford was a man consumed by ambition. A scholar of the occult, he had long been fascinated by the ancient texts that spoke of immortality, of the forbidden knowledge that promised eternal life at a terrible price. For years he had studied, his obsession growing with each passing day. But despite his vast collection of books and grimoires, the secret to true immortality remained elusive, slipping through his fingers like water. It wasn't until he discovered the Codex Mortis, a dark and forgotten manuscript, that he found what he had been searching for. The text, bound in the skin of some long-dead creature, was a roadmap to eternal life, an unholy path that required sacrifices, blood, and the flesh of the innocent. The rituals described within its pages were grotesque, their details so vile that they seemed to defy the very nature of life itself. But Victor, driven by his insatiable thirst for power, was undeterred. He began his descent into madness quietly, carefully. He chose his victims with precision: lonely wanderers, the homeless, the faceless souls who would not be missed. Each one was a means to an end, a piece of the puzzle that would grant him the immortality he craved. The first ritual was simple: a knife, a prayer, and the sacrifice of flesh. As he cut into his victim's body, he felt the power surge through him, the magic that had been hidden for centuries coursing through his veins. But it was only the beginning. Victor's body began to change after each ritual. At first it was subtle. His skin grew tighter, more youthful, and his once gray hair darkened. His eyes, once dull and tired, now gleamed with an unnatural brightness. But as he continued his work, the changes became more pronounced, more grotesque. His fingers elongated, the nails thickening into sharp, claw-like points. His once smooth skin began to stretch and ripple, as though something was trying to claw its way out from beneath. Yet with each change, Victor's power grew. He felt stronger, more vibrant, his mind sharper than it had ever been. The rituals worked. He was becoming something more, something immortal. But there was a price to pay. The flesh of the innocent, once so tender and pure, had begun to corrupt him. It was not just the blood that nourished him, but the very essence of their souls that he consumed. And as he took more and more lives, he felt his humanity slipping away, like sand through his fingers. His reflection in the mirror grew more monstrous with each passing day. His face twisted, his features elongated, and his once human form was slowly being replaced by something else, something inhuman. Victor could feel it now, the darkness that had taken root in his soul, spreading through his veins like a poison. His body was no longer his own. The rituals had begun to warp him, turning him into a creature of flesh and shadow. His hands trembled as he looked at them, his fingers now long and sinewy, covered in patches of skin that had turned an unnatural shade of gray. His once beautiful face was now a twisted mockery of humanity, his eyes sunken and black, the whites completely obscured by a veil of darkness. But still, he could not stop. The hunger had taken hold of him, gnawing at his insides, urging him to find more victims, to feed on their flesh and grow stronger. The power was addictive, and with each new life he took, he could feel himself drawing closer to his goal: true immortality. It was then that he realized the full extent of the curse he had unleashed. As his body transformed, so too did his mind. The more he consumed, the more he lost himself to the darkness. The once innocent man who had sought immortality had become a monster, a creature that no longer resembled the man he had once been. His very soul had been corrupted, devoured by the hunger for eternal life. One night, after a particularly gruesome ritual, Victor stood before a mirror, staring at his reflection in horror. The man who stared back at him was no longer human. His face was a grotesque mask of flesh, his eyes hollow pits of darkness, and his mouth stretched into a permanent twisted grin. His body was a patchwork of skin and bone, the flesh of his victims now part of him, their essence forever intertwined with his own. As he reached out to touch the mirror, the reflection in front of him smiled back, but it was not his smile. It was a smile of something ancient and evil, something that had long since forgotten the meaning of mercy. The transformation was complete. He was no longer Victor Ashford. He was something else, something that had transcended humanity, but at a terrible cost. The hunger, however, did not subside. It had only grown stronger. He could feel it gnawing at his insides, urging him to find more victims, to consume more flesh. But he knew, deep down, that there would be no end to it. The immortality he had so desperately sought had come at a price too high to bear. The more he fed, the more. The forgotten faces. Eliza awoke in a sterile white room, her head pounding as though the weight of 1,000 voices had been pressing against her skull. The soft beep of a monitor was the only sound, a constant reminder that she was alive, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to be. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked against the harsh light that flooded the room. She was in a hospital, she realized, but she couldn't remember how she had gotten there. Her heart began to race as she tried to sit up, the sterile sheets tangling around her legs. A nurse, a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, was standing by her bedside, adjusting the IV drip. The nurse's face was familiar, yet Eliza couldn't place her name. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "How are you feeling?" the nurse asked, her voice gentle. Eliza tried to answer, but her mind was blank. The nurse's face was warm, but it was like looking at someone through a fog. There was something unsettling about the familiarity, something that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. I don't know," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "Where am I? What happened?" The nurse paused, her smile faltering for just a moment before it returned, brighter, as if it were a practiced gesture. "You were brought in a few days ago after a fall. Don't you remember?" A fall. The words echoed in Eliza's mind, but they meant nothing to her. She searched her memory, but there was nothing. Just a vast, empty void where her past should have been. The nurse's expression softened. "Don't worry. You'll remember soon enough." But Eliza wasn't so sure. She could feel something stirring deep within her, a sense of dread that seemed to grow with every passing second. She glanced around the room, her gaze settling on the door. It was closed, but she could hear muffled voices outside, the faint shuffle of footsteps. As the nurse turned to leave, Eliza felt a sudden compulsion to speak. "Wait, do I know you?" The nurse froze, her back still turned, and for a moment, Eliza could have sworn she saw her shoulders stiffen. Then, with a soft sigh, the nurse turned back around, her face once again a mask of warmth. "You'll remember soon, I promise." But the words did little to comfort Eliza. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, Eliza's confusion deepened. The hospital staff, the doctors, the nurses, they all seemed so familiar, yet their names eluded her. Each one had a face she recognized, but when she tried to recall their names, the memories slipped through her fingers like water. It was as though she had known them for a lifetime, but the connection was a shadow, just out of reach. And then, there were the patients. She began to notice them in the halls, in the rooms next to hers. Their faces were hauntingly familiar too, as if she had seen them before in some forgotten dream. She would catch their eyes, and they would look back at her with the same vacant, knowing stare, as though they were waiting for her to remember something. Something terrible. One afternoon, Eliza ventured out of her room, her curiosity pushing her to explore the hospital. She wandered through the long, empty hallways, the fluorescent lights humming above her head. The silence was suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was then that she saw him, a man sitting alone in a chair by a window, staring out at the world beyond. His face was as familiar as the others, but there was something about him that made her stop in her tracks. His eyes were hollow, sunken, and his lips trembled as though he was about to speak. "Do you remember?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Eliza took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Remember what?" The man's eyes flickered with a strange recognition, and he smiled, though the smile was twisted, almost mournful. "You've been here before. We all have." Before Eliza could respond, the nurse appeared again, her warm smile in place, but there was a coldness behind her eyes now. "It's time for you to rest," she said, her voice firm, almost too firm. The man looked at her, his face contorting with fear. "You can't keep her here. She has to remember. She has to know the truth." The nurse's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something far more sinister. "She doesn't need to remember," she said, her voice low and menacing. "Not yet." Eliza's mind raced as she was gently but firmly escorted back to her room. What did he mean? What truth? And why did everyone seem to be hiding something from her? That night, as Eliza lay in her bed, the whispers began. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing against her ear, but growing louder with each passing moment. They came from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around her. She could hear the words clearly now, though they were laced with fear and urgency. "You've been here before. You've been here before." The words echoed in. The Last Supper. It was supposed to be an evening of celebration, a reunion of old friends, laughter and nostalgia, at the grand estate of their enigmatic host, Victor Graves. The mansion, perched on a cliff overlooking a dark, brooding sea, had always been a place of mystery. Its walls, adorned with strange portraits and antique furnishings, seemed to whisper of secrets long buried. Yet for all its eerie grandeur, it was a place of comfort for those who had known Victor in their youth. The invitation had arrived unexpectedly, but none of them hesitated to accept. It had been years since they had all gathered together, and the promise of an extravagant dinner, paired with the allure of the mansion's secluded location, was too enticing to pass up. As they arrived, they were greeted by Victor himself, his smile wide and warm, though his eyes seemed to carry a distant, unsettling gleam. His voice was smooth and commanding, but there was something unnervingly off about his presence. He led them into the grand dining hall, where a long, polished table awaited them, set with fine china, crystal goblets, and an array of dishes that smelled tantalizingly delicious. The evening began like any other dinner party. Casual conversation, the clinking of glasses, and laughter filling the air. The friends, a tight-knit group from their college days, reminisced about old times, exchanged stories, and enjoyed the lavish feast that Victor had so carefully prepared. Yet, as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen tension. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the flickering candlelight cast strange, elongated shapes on the walls. It was then that Victor stood, his voice cutting through the conversation. "My friends," he said, his tone suddenly dark and deliberate, "this evening has been years in the making. What you do not know is that tonight you are not merely guests in my home. You are part of something far greater and far darker." A nervous chuckle rippled through the group, but Victor's gaze silenced them all. He continued, his words slow and deliberate. "You see, I have spent years studying the old ways, the forgotten rituals, the rites that bind life and death. And tonight you will bear witness to the culmination of my work." The room fell silent, the joviality of the evening vanishing in an instant. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared speak. Victor's eyes glinted with a feverish intensity, his lips curling into a smile that no longer seemed welcoming, but rather predatory. "Each of you," he said, stepping toward the table, "has been chosen for a reason. Each of you has a part to play in what is to come. And by the end of this night, only one of you will remain." A gasp escaped from one of the guests. Sarah, a young woman with a nervous laugh. "Victor, what are you talking about? This isn't funny." Victor's expression hardened, and he raised a hand. "It's no joke, Sarah. This is the Last Supper. The final meal before the ritual is complete." Panic spread through the group as the realization began to settle in. The food they had consumed, the wine they had drunk, had not been prepared for mere indulgence. It was part of the ritual, each dish, each sip, a carefully orchestrated element of Victor's dark plan. They were not guests at a dinner party. They were sacrifices. One by one, the friends began to feel the effects. A heaviness in their limbs, a nausea rising in their throats, as though their bodies were betraying them. The room seemed to close in, the walls growing tighter with every passing second. The candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed, as if alive. Victor stood at the head of the table, his hands raised in a silent incantation. The air grew thick with an otherworldly energy, and the friends, now fully aware of their grim fate, began to panic. They scrambled for the doors, but they were locked, sealed by an invisible force. Screams filled the room as they tried to escape, but it was futile. One by one they collapsed, their bodies racked with convulsions, their faces contorting in agony. Sarah was the first to fall, her body crumpling to the floor in a heap. Then James, Mark, and Lisa followed, their cries echoing through the mansion. Only two remained, Emily and Ben, the closest of friends, desperately clinging to each other as they fought to stay conscious. Victor watched them, his smile widening, the madness in his eyes growing. "There can only be one," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural growl. "Only one will survive to bear witness to the power that I have unlocked." Ben, his face pale and trembling, turned to Emily, his voice hoarse. "We have to stop him, we have to—" But before he could finish, Emily's body jerked violently, her eyes rolling back in her head as a dark force seemed to consume her from within. Ben tried to pull her away. The sinister smile. Mara's life was ordinary, quiet, uneventful, and filled with the mundane rhythm of day-to-day existence. She worked as a barista at a small cafe in the city, lived in a modest apartment, and spent her evenings watching television or reading. There was nothing remarkable about her life, nothing to suggest that anything dark or sinister lurked in the corners of her world. That is, until he appeared. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a man with a broad, unsettling smile. She saw him in passing as she walked home from work, standing on the corner, leaning against a lamppost, his eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. But she thought nothing of it. After all, it was just a coincidence. People smiled all the time. But then, it happened again. The same man, the same wide, unnerving smile, standing in a different part of the city, just watching her. His eyes gleamed with something she couldn't quite place, something that felt wrong. She hurried past, shaking off the uneasy feeling that crept up her spine. The next day, she saw him again, and the day after that. Each time his smile grew wider, more grotesque, as though it were stretching beyond the natural limits of his face. She could no longer ignore the fact that the man was following her, appearing at places she frequented. The cafe, the grocery store, even her own street. And no matter how fast she walked or how far she went, he was always there, lurking in the background, his smile growing more and more unsettling with each encounter. Mara tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just a stranger who happened to be in the same places at the same time. But the longer it went on, the more impossible it became to ignore. His smile was no longer just a simple expression of friendliness. It had become something twisted, something that gnawed at her very soul. One night, after closing the cafe, Mara walked home alone, the streets empty and silent. She felt the weight of his presence before she even saw him. Her heart began to race as she turned the corner, and there he was, standing in the shadows, his smile gleaming in the dim light of the street lamp. But tonight, his smile was different. It wasn't just wide, it was contorted, stretching unnaturally, as though his lips were being pulled back by some invisible force. His teeth were sharp, like the fangs of a predator, and his eyes gleamed with an unnatural hunger. "Why are you following me?" Mara asked, her voice trembling with fear. The man didn't answer. He simply stood there, smiling, his eyes never leaving hers. She took a step back, her breath quickening, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The smile grew wider, impossibly wide, and his eyes darkened, filling with an abyss of emptiness. She could feel the coldness of his gaze, as though it were sucking the warmth from her very being. And then, the voice came. It wasn't from his mouth, but from everywhere, a voice that echoed in her mind, low and insistent. "You belong to me now." Mara stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. Her body refused to obey her commands. She could hear him moving behind her, his footsteps matching hers, as though he were always just a step away. She reached her apartment building, her breath ragged, and slammed the door shut behind her. But even as she locked it, she could still hear the faint sound of his laughter, soft, chilling, like a distant echo of something far darker. That night, as she lay in bed, trying to sleep, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, like a breeze brushing against her ear, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. She could hear him in the walls, in the shadows, in the very air around her. "You can't escape me." Mara clutched her pillow to her chest, trying to block out the voice, but it was no use. The man's smile was everywhere now, in her dreams, in the reflection of her mirror, in the faces of strangers she passed on the street. His presence was suffocating, inescapable. Days turned into weeks, and Mara's life began to unravel. She couldn't concentrate at work. She couldn't sleep. The man was always there, always watching, always smiling. His smile had become a constant fixture in her world, a reminder that she was never alone. She tried to tell her friends, but they dismissed her fears as stress, as exhaustion. They couldn't see him, couldn't understand the horror that had taken root in her mind. And then one night she saw him again. This time, not on the street or in the shadows, but standing at the foot of her bed, his smile so wide it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of his face. His eyes were black, hollow pits, and his teeth glistened like daggers in the moonlight. "You're mine," the voice whispered, louder now, more commanding. "You've always been mine." Mara tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move. The thing in the basement. When Rachel and Thomas Weston first saw the house, they were immediately drawn to it. The sprawling Victorian mansion, with its ivy-clad walls and towering windows, seemed like a dream come true. It was the kind of house they had always imagined living in, grand, with history embedded in every creaking floorboard and ornate fixture. But the price had been far lower than they expected. The real estate agent had been cryptic about the house's history, mentioning only that it had been abandoned for decades due to a family tragedy. The basement was the first thing that caught Rachel's attention. There was a door, hidden behind a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, that had been sealed shut for years. She asked the agent about it, but he only muttered something about it being unsafe and advised them to leave it alone. Thomas, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as nothing more than an old, forgotten part of the house. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something waiting. The day they moved in, Rachel found herself drawn to the basement once again. The door that had been sealed for so long now seemed to beckon her, its rusted lock almost inviting her to open it. Despite Thomas's objections, Rachel insisted. She needed to know what was hidden beneath the house. With a crowbar, she pried open the door. The stale air that poured out was thick with the scent of decay, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the light from her flashlight. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before stepping down into the basement, her heart pounding in her chest. Thomas, reluctantly following behind her, muttered under his breath, but curiosity was too strong to ignore. The basement was far larger than either of them had expected. Old furniture, broken crates, and discarded belongings littered the floor. But it was the far corner of the room that caught their attention. There, partially obscured by shadows, was a large stone structure, a cell, its walls thick with the wear of time. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as though something ancient and malevolent had been trapped inside for centuries. Rachel moved closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could see markings on the stone walls, strange symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. It was then that she heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, emanating from the darkness. "Rachel, we need to leave," Thomas said, his voice trembling. This isn't right." But Rachel couldn't pull herself away. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, and the growl intensified, turning into a sharp, piercing screech. The ground beneath them trembled, and the stone door of the cell began to crack open, as though it had been waiting for someone to unlock it. A shadow moved inside, a figure so ancient and twisted that it was hard to comprehend. It was humanoid in shape, but its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin a mottled, sickly gray, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black voids, filled with a terrible emptiness. The creature let out a hiss, its breath foul and hot against Rachel's face. "Leave. Now," Thomas pleaded, his voice breaking. But as he tried to pull Rachel away, he froze, his body stiff with fear. The creature's gaze had locked onto him. The basement seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. The creature in the cell was no longer alone. From the shadows, others began to emerge, smaller, equally grotesque beings that moved with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing with hunger. Rachel's heart raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The creature wasn't just feeding on them. It was feeding on their fear. And the more terrified they became, the stronger it grew. Thomas, his face pale with terror, turned to flee, but the air itself seemed to hold him in place. The basement had become a trap, and the more they struggled, the more it tightened its grip. The creatures surrounded them, their voices a cacophony of whispers and growls, each one feeding off the terror that radiated from Rachel and Thomas. The walls of the basement seemed to pulse with life, the stone shifting and groaning as though it were alive. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching like dark fingers reaching for them. The creatures were closing in, their jagged teeth glinting in the dim light, their hunger insatiable. Rachel felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The growl grew louder, a deafening roar that rattled her bones, and then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, low, and venomous. "You should not have come." In that moment, Rachel understood. The house had not been abandoned by accident. The creatures in the basement had been waiting, trapped for generations by a family who had tried to contain their darkness. But the seal had been broken. The fear had been awakened. And now, it was their turn. The cursed painting. Liam had always been drawn to art. Its colors, its forms, its ability to capture the raw, untold stories of the human soul. But his own artistic journey had been less than fruitful. Despite years of trying, his canvases remained blank. His inspiration dried up like an autumn leaf, brittle and lifeless. A sense of deep despair had begun to settle in his bones, a feeling that his dreams of being a successful artist would never be more than a distant fantasy. One Saturday morning, in an attempt to find something to rekindle his passion, Liam wandered through a local flea market. His eyes scanned the worn tables and faded booths, looking for a relic of inspiration, anything that might reignite the fire within him. It was in a dusty corner of an old stall that he found it, an unfinished painting. The canvas was large, its frame wooden and scratched with age. The painting itself was dark, brooding, a figure standing in a desolate landscape, its back turned to the viewer. The brushstrokes were rough and incomplete, but there was something about it that caught Liam's eye. It spoke to him in a way that no other painting ever had, a feeling that gripped him, as though the figure on the canvas were calling him closer. The price was cheap, too, almost too cheap to believe. Without hesitation, he bought it. The moment the painting entered his apartment, Liam felt a strange sense of unease. It was as if the room had grown colder, as if the shadows were deeper, darker. He placed the painting in his studio, where the light was dim and the air thick with dust. There, he thought, it could rest, unfinished, until he figured out how to bring it to life. But as the days passed, something began to happen. The painting didn't remain still. It changed. The figure, once merely standing in a barren field, began to move. Its posture shifted. Its face became clearer, twisted in an expression of pain. And then, one morning, Liam awoke to find that the figure was no longer alone. There were shadows in the background, dark shapes, whispering in the edges of his vision. But when he looked directly at them, they disappeared. He dismissed it as his imagination, but deep inside, he felt a chill that wouldn't leave him. Over the next few days, the changes grew more pronounced. The figure now had eyes, hollow, soulless pits of darkness, and its mouth was stretched in a silent scream. The shadows in the painting no longer merely lurked in the background. They had grown larger, more distinct, as though the painting itself was consuming something. But what frightened Liam the most was that the scenes depicted were eerily familiar. The death of a loved one, a bloody car crash, a decaying corpse. Each night as he worked late into the evening, the images grew darker and more specific, reflecting his worst fears, his most deeply hidden anxieties. Then, one night, it happened. As Liam worked on his own canvases, his eyes kept returning to the cursed painting. The figure in the painting had changed again. This time, the scene was different. The figure was holding a knife, standing over a bloodied body, and the blood was dripping from the blade, pooling around the figure's feet. It was as though the painting was alive, telling its own story, one that seemed to mirror the very depths of his tortured soul. Terrified, Liam tried to remove the painting from his studio, to burn it, to destroy it in any way possible, but no matter what he did, the painting refused to leave. He tried covering it with a cloth, but when he uncovered it, the scene had shifted once more, now depicting the image of Liam himself, standing in the center, with dark figures lurking around him, pulling him toward an abyss. The chilling realization struck him like a blow. The painting was feeding off him, growing stronger with every passing moment, every fear he had ever harbored. Desperate, Liam sought out the original seller of the painting, but the old flea market stall was gone. In its place was an empty lot, the air thick with an unsettling silence. He was left with no answers, no guidance, only the cursed painting and the unrelenting terror that followed it. Night after night, the painting grew darker, more twisted. The figure in the painting began to reach out of the canvas, its fingers stretching toward him, its gaze following him around the room. Every time he looked at it, the terror intensified. His dreams became nightmares, filled with images of the very scenes he feared most. His loved ones torn apart, his life unraveling into chaos and bloodshed. The very air in his apartment felt thick, as though the walls themselves were closing in. But it wasn't until one fateful evening that Liam realized the true extent of the painting's curse. He had been working late into the night, staring at the cursed image as it seemed to call to him. He was overcome by a deep, suffocating dread, and before he knew it, his body was moving toward the canvas, as if drawn by some unseen force.